Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining this year's Corruption Prevention Integrity Insights Forum. Today's forum will explore conflicts of interest, drawing on case studies and research from IBAC and other integrity and government agencies. I'm David Wolf. I'm the Deputy Commissioner here at IBAC, and I'll be hosting the forum today. First up this morning, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm working and living on the lands of traditional owners. I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and extend my respects to those members of the Aboriginal communities that are attending here today. It's great so many of you could join us for today's webinar. We've received over 400 registrations, 450 as of this morning, so thank you very much for those that are attending. And we've got representatives from agencies all over metropolitan Melbourne and regional Victoria, and from a broad range of sectors, including local government, state government, other agencies, which is terrific. And I particularly welcome all those attendees from metropolitan Melbourne that are enduring the health restrictions at the moment. Today's an opportunity for you to hear perspectives on conflict of interest from a number of agencies. The forum will focus on the importance of identifying, disclosing and managing conflicts of interest, and how corruption risks can arise if conflicts of interest are not properly identified or managed. That's both in a metropolitan and a regional context. And first, we'll start by hearing from two keynote speakers, Commissioner Adam Fennessy from the Victorian Public Sector Commission, and Julie Reid, who's the Executive Director of Local Government Victoria. The keynote presentations will be followed by a presentation from Kate Radigan, who's the Deputy Secretary at the Department of Education. You'll also have the opportunity to participate in today's webinar during our interactive conflict of interest scenario session, where I'll be joined by Assistant Ombudsman Rob Hocking from the Victorian Ombudsman's Office and Chief Municipal Inspector Michael Stevanovic from the Local Government Inspectorate. Rob and Michael and I will discuss several scenarios and pose some related questions which you'll be able to participate in and answer some online questions. There'll be an opportunity after each presentation today to ask questions of our presenters. We'll have an audience Q&A session at the end, so I encourage you to submit any comments or questions throughout today's webinar by using the Q&A function. A recording of the forum will be available after today's session, and we can also share the presentation slides, which you'll see. We hope that you'll take away some useful insights and some learnings from today's forum. So why is conflict of interest such an important issue? And I thought I'd start this morning by providing a quick overview of conflict of interest cases and allegations received by IBAC over the last 2 years. Over the last 2 years, 12% of all cases received at IBAC contained allegations of a conflict of interest. So it's a really high proportion. Over a third of all local government cases and around 1/5 of all state government cases contain at least one allegation of a conflict of interest. Our data confirms what I'm sure many of you already know, that there are a number of common public administration functions at risk of being undermined by undisclosed or unmanaged conflicts of interest. In 25% of all cases, the conflict of interest was alleged to have occurred in the context of recruitment or promotion of the staff. In 21% of cases, the conflict of interest was alleged to have taken place in the context of procurement, most often in the selection process, but also in the course of ongoing contract management with a business or a supplier. A failure to comply with recruitment procedures and procurement processes was identified as key issues within IBAC's Operation Maru, which was a recent investigation IBAC published, and it was into alleged corrupt conduct by a former CEO of the Victorian Regional Health Service. Last year, conflict of interest cases reported to IBAC increased by over 26%. And this may have been a result of the public interest disclosure regime in Victoria, as public interest disclosures are a major source of conflict of interest cases. The data and investigations from across integrity agencies also highlights there are numerous other functions at risk when it comes to conflicts of interest, including grants and program funding, the decision-making around planning and developments, information collection and management and engagement of consultants, and engagement of contractors, just to name a few. These are some really interesting and stark figures for all of us that we can reflect upon. And I could talk for a lot longer on the data that we hold, but I'll circle back to the question I posed earlier, which is, why is conflict of interest such an important issue? And as we all know, trust in institutions, government and public administration is constantly being challenged. And every time there is a decision made where a conflict of interest is either perceived or suspected, That then again affects the reputation or the trust in the public institutions. So it's up to all of us to identify those conflicts, to manage them properly, and importantly, communicate when we have a decision around the conflict of interest management, which is often the source of concerns that arise from either external parties or within internal employees. So on that note, I'd like to move to our first formal speaker. I'd like to introduce Commissioner Adam Fennessy from the Victorian Public Sector Commission. Adam has over 20 years public sector experience at state and federal levels, including 4 years as Secretary of the Victorian Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. And prior to that, the Department of Environment and Primary Industries. It's a bit of a tongue twister. Adam's also worked in the private sector as a partner with advisory firm Ernst & Young. Adam's also served on several boards, including the Institute of Public Administration Australia, Infrastructure Victoria, Monash Sustainable Development Institute, and Women in Leadership Australia. Adam is a fellow of IBAC Victoria and a member of the Champions of Change Coalition. In 2018, he received a Public Service Medal for leadership in the Victorian public sector. Today, Adam will reflect on the work of the Victorian Public Sector Commission and the tools and guidance material available to the public sector to properly manage conflict of interest, including insights and advice regarding risks and mitigation strategies related to conflicts of interest and how these can play out differently across metropolitan and regional areas. Thank you, and over to you, Adam.
Thank you very much, David, for that very warm introduction. My name is Adam Fennessy, and I'd like to start by acknowledging country and acknowledging the custodians and traditional owners of the lands from wherever you are dialing in today. I'm on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. I want to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, acknowledge wherever you're dialing in from and custodians of that country, and also any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who will be on the call with us today. So I'm very excited, David, to start the discussion today. You would have heard from my introduction that I've spent most of my career in Victorian state government. I've also worked in the Commonwealth government and in the private sector and consulted into local government, state, federal government, worked with a lot of not-for-profits. So as well as bringing a state government perspective from the Victorian Public Sector Commission, I also want to reflect on what this means for so many other people who have joined us for today's session. And I do want to call out, David has already done this, it's so encouraging to have over 400 people registered for today and seeing the very broad range of people and organisations that are represented here today. We've got Victorian state government departments, statutory authorities and regulators, which is great to see. We've got many different local governments represented here today from across Victoria, and I've also seen some registrations from interstate colleagues, so welcome if you are dialing in from outside Victoria. We also have TAFEs, hospitals, health boards, universities, schools, consultants, people that work in and across public sector from outside. We've got investigators, police, lawyers, industry associations, not-for-profits, unions. So I think that is very encouraging that we've got this broad community of interest in such critical issues around integrity, the prevention of corruption, the support of integrity across all the different sectors that we work in. And in particular, what does that mean around conflict of interest? What are some of the learnings and tools that we can share from the Victorian Public Sector Commission? A very quick word about what we do at the Public Sector Commission. We are very much part of the overall integrity system. And when I move to my next slide, I'll say a few words about that. But we're here to support the skills, the integrity, and the professionalism of the Victorian public service and sector. And in the Victorian Public Service, we have over 50,000 people working in core government departments. And in the broader Victorian public sector, we have 330,000 employers. So that is a big cohort and a big part of the Victorian economy and community. And in that broader public sector, we have schools, hospitals, TAFEs, all sorts of different statutory entities, and many of the organisations that are part of the session today. So that's a bit of an overview about what we do at the public sector, and I'll talk a bit more about that in detail in my following slides. So I'll move to my first slide today, and I should say that these slides will be shared and made available following the session, so you don't need to remember everything I'm talking about. The first slide gives an overview of how we work across Victoria in terms of our integrity system. You can see on this slide, there's a bit of detail there, but the things I want to draw your attention to are those key integrity agencies, IBAC, and David Wolf has just introduced us as one of the Deputy Commissioners of IBAC, the Victorian Ombudsman. We've got Rosalind Wozniak and Robert Hocking here today from Victorian Ombudsman, the Victorian Auditor General's Office, and other critical parts of that integrity system include the local government inspectorate, and we have Mick Stefanovic as part of or representing LGI today. So while this is looking at some of the Victorian government institutions around integrity, the local government inspectorate plays a key role for the local government sector across Victoria. And there are other commissions, including our own Victorian Public Sector Commission and independent commissions like the Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission. But in particular, looking at how we work together, you'll see from that slide that IBAC has got the deep legislative and independent investigative powers to expose and prevent public sector corruption and misconduct, and also has jurisdiction relating to police. The Victorian Ombudsman investigates administrative actions of state government departments, local government and statutory authorities. The Ombudsman is also independent and has strong legislative investigative powers. And then the Victorian Auditor General's Office, which provides assurance and oversight to the Victorian Parliament and the Victorian community on the financial integrity and the performance of the state. And it'll be well known to many of you that these systems are often replicated in other jurisdictions. In the Victorian context, IBAC, Ombudsman and VARGO, or the Auditor General's Office, has oversight coming from the Victorian Parliament. So it sits outside government departments and the administrative or executive part of government. It's got that core independent oversight. And alongside the local government inspectorate plays a critical role, and you'll hear more from Mick later today. So I wanted to start with that because we all work together. And one of the most important things in the integrity system and in managing and preventing corruption starts with education, behaviours, and building trust and confidence in the system so that we don't have to go to those independent powers of investigation and criminal proceedings. In any system, in any human system, we always have to have the full range of tools. And it's very well known that from time to time we have unfortunate events of corruption which are fully investigated, and people and organisations are held accountable, particularly by IBAC and the Ombudsman, where we've got those deeper investigative powers. What's really important in that system as well is that broad preventative and educative role. That's where we get very involved as the Commission. We do a lot of work with IBAC and the Ombudsman and the Auditor General's Office. And that's where these networks and these communities of discussion and practice are so critical. So that's my opening slide, and I've spent a bit more time on that just to emphasise that we all work very closely together. We share data, we share insights, we work closely together with our professional networks and our staff, all to make sure, and this is a key theme for me today, that we maintain and invest in trust in government. Now, we've heard so many times, if you're in the public sector or work in public administration, or if you work with us or alongside us, we talk about taxpayers' money, ratepayers' money. We are their custodians for the public interest, for that money of other people that we are in a privileged position to invest through programs, invest in communities, invest in the economy, but we are there as custodians and as stewards. It is not our money, and that's why it is so important to be very clear about what our role is and very clear about what our role isn't. And when conflicts arise, which will happen in any complex system, be very clear about how to manage those conflicts, how to be clear about declaring them, managing them, and making sure that we maintain the trust and confidence of the communities with whom we work and for whom we serve. So the key themes today for me are about trust and about those approaches of identifying, declaring, and managing conflicts of interest. So I'll move to the next slide. And the next slide shows more specifically what we do at the Victorian Public Sector Commission. You'll see the graphic down the bottom. There are 7 core public sector values that are set out in legislation, so set out by the Victorian Parliament through the Public Administration Act. that require public officials, including directors of government boards and statutory office holders, senior executives in government departments, and all public sector employees in Victoria to demonstrate those core 7 public sector values. And you can see them: responsiveness, integrity, impartiality, accountability, respect, leadership, and human rights. Now, in terms of Victorian government, I work in the middle of Melbourne on Treasury Place, in 3 Treasury Place, and in the building next to me, 2 Treasury Place, which is where our education department is housed. And you'll hear Kate Radigan speak from the education department. Those 7 values are on the outside of the building in colour and in clear relief, and it's a great constant reminder that we are here to serve and support others, whether it's supporting and delivering education services, health, policing, transport, managing the environment or other public assets. It's a good reminder, which is why I'm showing them here today. And in particular, those public sector values are incorporated into codes of conduct that we issue under the Public Sector or the Public Administration Act. Those codes of conduct are mandatory and are required by legislation to be based on those values. And legislation provides for the code of conduct to promote adherence to public sector values. So we have prepared and issued 3 mandatory codes of conduct under our Act. One is for public sector employees, one is for public entities, and finally for public sector employees of special bodies that are part of the broader public sector. So I won't say any more than that because there's a lot of information on that slide, but that's to give you a sense of how within Victorian government, we've got that specific legislative approach that starts with values. And I say values again because it does start with trust, confidence, and connection with the communities with whom we serve. And those values are then underpinned by legislation and incorporated into codes of conduct that apply to all Victorian public sector employees. So that's a critical part of what we do. And within that overall integrity system, how that sits alongside the very specific legislative and investigative powers of IBAC and the Ombudsman, and the overall oversight that the Auditor General brings. So that shows what we do within the system, and it starts with values, behaviours, and that educative and preventative approach to managing and supporting integrity. I'll go to the next slide. And on the next slide, you can see there's a lot of guidance that we publish. Now, there's a fair bit of information on that slide, but because we'll share this presentation, I encourage people to see the links here. And on our website, for any agency across Victorian government, we have published resources, including a model conflict of interest policy, conflict declaration form templates, so that you can use those within your organisations, high-level processes for managing consensual personal relationships in the workplace, and also guidance and checklists on assessing conflict of interest risks. We've got specific circulars as well for government directors or directors on the boards of government entities. This is a very important resource that we develop, and we work very closely with our colleagues, particularly in IBAC, on these materials. And while these are specific to Victorian government, they're good templates and resources for others to look at and use as an example. It's important to make sure that from whatever other jurisdiction you might be working in, if you're from interstate or if you're in the local government jurisdiction under the Local Government Act, that you make sure that what you use is specific to your jurisdiction. But in particular, we put these tools out across Victorian government. We have some very small agencies who won't have the resources to develop a full suite of tools from scratch. So these templates are a great starting point. And in fact, all the way through to the very big and well-resourced Victorian government agencies, these templates ensure a consistency of approach so that we manage this in a very clear way across Victorian government. So I do encourage you following today to look at those resources. And there's some excellent complementary resources, particularly on the IBAC website, an excellent fact sheet, conflict of interest, myths, misconceptions and management. So I'm sure you hear today a lot about the tools and resources. Many of you will be already very familiar and will be using these, but for others who want to learn more about this, or if you work into government, it's a good way for you to see the conditions under which we work and what we have to do and what we expect our partners to do with us when we're managing public money, taxpayers and ratepayers' money, keeping the trust of the public and working within that integrity system. So there are a couple of the key slides. I've got a few more slides which I'll go through a bit more quickly. Turning to the next slide, this sets out the specific types of conflicts of interest and goes to the heart of a lot of what we'll discuss today. Now, I don't want to turn this into an academic lecture, but you'll see there are examples of different private interests, financial interests, non-financial interests, personal relationships. Now, in particular, because of the complexity and size of government, there will be financial interests that public officials will have that may come into conflict with their public duties. There will be non-financial interests that don't relate specifically to money, but may relate to relationships and positions of influence. And there will be relationships that we will be in that may give rise to a potential or an actual conflict of interest. So the issue is not that these conflicts cannot take place or cannot exist. The issue is that they will. What do we do to manage them? What do we do to minimise them? What do we do to identify, declare, and manage as a really good rule of thumb in every case? So that gives you a sense of conflict of interest. We also talk on this slide about a conflict of duty, particularly for public officials who may sit on boards and may also have other duties in their role, or have overlapping roles where a potential conflict might arise and needs to be managed. So that's a quick overview, without getting too academic, of the range of conflicts of interest that can exist. They do exist, and the issue is more, how do we identify, declare, and manage those so that we work consistently with public sector values and maintain the trust of our communities and continue to then deliver high quality public services. So on my next few slides, we go into extra detail about what to do about these conflicts of interest. This is where I also recommend you look at that IBAC fact sheet. So on the following slide, it shows that conflicts of interest can be actual, where there is in fact a current conflict between a public official's public duties and other public or private duties. It could be potential, where a conflict may arise, and it could be perceived. And in many cases within public sector, issues arise to a perceived conflict. And you'll see, particularly in the IBAC materials, people might say, well, I don't think I have an issue. I'll handle this carefully. I'm a very good person who works with integrity. But if there's a perception that an external, reasonable person might say, well, I think there is a problem here, the perception alone gives rise to the need to identify, declare, and manage that conflict of interest. And you can see there, I've put down the reasonable person test. If you think you have a conflict of interest or duty, ask yourself, what would a reasonable person think about this situation? Would they make a decision in light of the same facts or circumstances? I also like the idea of the common sense check. And to me, a critical approach that arises particularly from the IBAC materials, and we recommend this as well, if you are not sure in your own situation as a public official, the best thing to do is talk, ask, and communicate the issue to others in your team, to your manager, to your organisation. Have a conversation, seek advice. We all have these issues that will arise from time to time, particularly about perceived or in some cases potential or actual conflicts of interest. And the best thing to do in every case is identify, declare, and manage. In my own case, to give you examples, I lived for more than 10 years in regional Victoria, and I do want to make a comment that the strength of living within regional communities is we're very connected. We really understand a lot of the key people across our community and across our sectors. The challenge is we're all very connected, which means conflicts of interest might arise more so compared to a big and distributed and diluted metropolitan city like Melbourne. Conflicts, of course, can still arise in Melbourne, but in regional communities, it can be a challenge. And in my own case, having lived in a regional community for 10 years, my partner was on a number of boards. So I had to be very clear about how I managed those potential perceived or actual conflicts. And in every case, I identified, declared, and I managed. And in one case, I sought very specific advice to make sure that I knew if there was an issue. And the most important thing to do is have that conversation, ask, check, talk to others, seek advice, use the tools and materials that we're sharing today. So there's some insights and some examples about conflict of interest and duty. And of course, there's no great difference, or there's no specific difference between the integrity of public officials who might live in regional Victoria or regional Australia compared to metropolitan. But because of the way regional communities are so connected and are smaller in population, those issues may arise more so purely from a quantitative perspective, and always coming back to that idea of maintaining and managing trust, asking the question, identifying, declaring and managing actual perceived or potential conflicts. So with my last couple of slides, before I hand back to David, you'll see there's a very important set of guidance we issue to public sector agencies. And on the next slide, we talk about the 5 R's, and I'm going to add 2 more R's today. So if a conflict of interest is declared and identified, in terms of managing, the 5 strategies that we recommend are restrict and remove ourselves from the potential or actual conflict, recruit, bring someone else in to oversight that matter who doesn't have a conflict, remove ourselves from the conflict by not participating. And we do see this quite regularly, for example, in board discussions where a board director might remove themselves for the discussion of a particular item. Relinquish. We can also then relinquish if we own, for example, shares in something that might overlap with our public duties. We can relinquish those shares, as an example. And in some cases, if the conflict is so specific, we may have to remove ourselves altogether from our role, resign. That could be temporary or permanent. And again, this doesn't question the integrity of the person involved. It's about managing the perceived, actual or potential conflict of interest based on good process and advice. And the other 2 R's I add to that are how do we record and register so that we've got clear transparency around what we did when the issue was identified, declared and managed. So the other 2 R's are setting up the record of conflicts and registering that. And we also have good resources and materials around that. So that is a fairly quick run through of conflict of interest. I do have one last slide, which I'll mention very briefly, that we also have the confidentiality that applies to directors to not disclose any information that they may be privy to if they are serving in their public role or serving on a board. So while that's not specific to conflict of interest, it relates to that broader transparency and maintaining trust and integrity in the process, and not sharing inappropriately any information we gain as a public official or perhaps a public board member, and not gaining any personal advantage on that to the detriment of the public entity. So I think in conclusion, for me, it's about being very aware whether you are individually involved, whether you're a manager supporting others in your team, or indeed if you are working into government and you're one of our partners, whether you're from the not-for-profit sector or the private sector, or you're a consultant, understanding that context that we will work in, and understanding that there are higher bars and thresholds because of those legislative requirements, those public sector values. And when we work through sometimes what might feel like additional process, that is to protect taxpayers' dollars, ratepayers' dollars, maintain trust and integrity with the community, with taxpayers and ratepayers, and overall deliver high quality and trusted public services and public outcomes. So thank you very much for your interest today. I am so encouraged to see the very broad range of people participating in the discussion. And it's great to be in this discussion alongside my colleagues from other integrity and public sector agencies. I hope that's given you some good ways to frame up this issue as we go into the rest of today. And in particular, I do encourage you to look at those resources, any resources that we have or other integrity agencies that will be sharing those with you today to really help you learn, set up best practice and make sure you are best set up to maintain the integrity and the prevention of corruption across the public sector in Victoria. So thank you. And David, I'll hand back to you.
Thanks very much, Adam. And that was a terrific presentation. It was a great overview of the integrity system and a particularly interesting overview of the role of the Victorian Public Sector Commissioner. I think the important thing, the theme that came through that presentation for me again was that trust, and it was what I alluded to at the start of the forum around the importance of the institutions acting in the interests of the community and being seen to act in the interests of the community, and where conflicts of interest can really impact on that. We have got time for some questions, and clearly it was a very engaging presentation because the questions are coming in quite strongly. And I'll open up with one, and it's a really interesting one, given your deep public sector experience, but also your experience in the private sector. I wonder if there is a comparison between conflicts of interest for the public and the private sector, and if there's any issues when there's a crossover of those two, perhaps different cultures.
Yeah, so look, I've got two comments. And when I spent 3 years working for a large consulting firm, I got a very interesting perspective back into the public sector, but also working with large publicly listed companies and private companies. My first reflection is that in the public sector, we work with taxpayers' money and ratepayers' money, and we work with powers from the Victorian Parliament. In the private sector, particularly with larger publicly listed companies, they are working with shareholders' money. So we are often there on behalf of others and entrusted by others to look after their investment. It might be superannuation, it might be shares, it might be that the private interests that are invested in companies. So in some ways, there are a lot of parallels with managing and declaring conflicts. And we see this in very clearly in those large publicly listed companies. But where it doesn't follow through fully is particularly with private interests, small private companies, or just individuals who have their own assets. They can manage their own money in whichever way they like. And I sometimes found there was a level of frustration from outside the public sector of the process of dealing back into the public sector. And one of my jobs was to work almost as a translator with my colleagues when I was in the private sector to say, governments need to maintain that integrity, that transparency. Governments need to account to parliaments, to external overseers like the Auditor General. We need to account also to the scrutiny that the media places, particularly on the public sector. So it's not an easy space to work in the public sector. It's a very scrutinised space compared to working as an individual business person, or perhaps working with a smaller private company. We do see that high level of scrutiny in publicly listed companies, and we see the appropriate levels of governance around that. But there are differences. So to me, it's really important that, for example, in today's session, we've got that broader community of interest around what does it mean to not just work in government, but work in the broader public purpose sector. And particularly if there is a measure of frustration, which I used to hear about government, it's understanding why that is there and why that is so important to be able to account for what we do. Because if you were dealing with me in the public sector for a new grant program or an investment, it's not my money that I'm making decisions over, it's someone else's money for a greater public good and a public purpose. So I certainly got that insight. I also found there were always good, new and efficient ways of doing things differently. And we hear a lot, and you'll hear some talk today about the data and analytics that we can use in the public sector to work more efficiently with how we manage integrity, use data and analysis to see where the trends are going, and to always try and optimise our dealings. Because the other thing is that while we have a lot of process, we also want to make sure that we're reaching those outcomes for education, for economy, for community outside of government. So I've seen that tension, David, and there's a lot to learn from each side. But to me, for the public sector, it does come back to trust and public sector values, and always asking the question, am I maintaining the trust and confidence of the community? And am I doing things in the best possible way, using the latest technology, the latest best practice, while also maintaining that transparency and integrity?
Right, that's a terrific answer. It certainly approached it from a different angle that most people would approach that sort of question. So thanks very much for that, Adam. I think we've got time for one more quick question. I'll just read it off the screen. In the past, I found Victoria didn't give great recognition to employment as a conflict. For example, conflict of interest policy concentrated on procurement alone. So any comment on the risk and prevalence of the issues of conflict in relation to employment arrangements?
Well, employment arrangements does give rise to various issues around conflict, and both when you are employed and recruited within government, there is a very specific process to declare any interests. but we then bring our interests along as part of a broader organisation or an employer. And that's why we've also, in the materials I spoke to, talked about the perceived or actual conflict of duties. So in terms of where we work and who we're employed by, do any issues come through that, any perceptions around conflicts around the duty to our employer as an employee and to the broader community that we might work for? Now, I'm not sure if that goes to the heart of the question that's been asked, but in particular, in line with that best practice approach that we support and IBAC supports, when you are an employee, it's important to identify, declare and manage any perceived actual conflicts. So when people start working, particularly in the Victorian Public Service, there's a very specific process for employment pre-screening, for declarations of interests, and that's very important, even though that might feel like an additional layer of process in the employee-employer relationship. It is there for that same purpose. So, David, I'm not sure if that goes to the specific question, but there's some comments that we see around the conditions for public sector employment, managing perceived and actual issues from the employee, and also potential conflicts around the duties within that employment organisation.
Indeed. Thank you very much for that response. And I think by the virtue of your response, you've actually answered the fact that it is a consideration now in conflicts of interest, where once it was focused purely on procurement activities, it's certainly a consideration now as a conflict of interest issue. Thanks so much for your presentation, Adam, and answering the questions. Please stay around for the forum. There may be some other issues that arise through the course of the presentations and questions that come up, which will certainly draw on your experience to answer. I'd like to move on now and formally introduce our next speaker, which is Julie Reid, Executive Director of Local Government Victoria. Julie has 32 years of experience working in local government, both nationally and internationally. She's a qualified Master of Planning and has a graduate diploma in management and a Bachelor of Arts in Urban Studies. Prior to her joining Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, which is Local Government Victoria's host department, as Executive Director, she held the role as the first female Chief Executive Officer at the City of Kingston. Julie also spent 10 years as an executive and a director at leading city development and engineering infrastructure portfolios at the City of Whitehorse and Greater Dandenong councils. Julie's career in local government also included working in large councils in the UK, including Westminster City Council, and in rural councils in New South Wales and a number of other Victorian councils, including Casey and Bayside. So an extraordinary experience in terms of local government entities, both in Australia and overseas. Julie's diverse experience in local government has seen her contribute to planning, urban design, sustainability, economic development, building, waste, capital work, delivery, community engagement, arts, culture, events, and that's just about every portfolio I think you can tick off in local government. So it's an incredible work experience that you do have across that sector, Julie. So Julie will share some insights and advice on conflicts of interest faced by councils in both metropolitan and regional locations, and reflect on the changes regarding identification and management of conflicts of interest in the context of the new Local Government Act of 2020, which has recently been introduced and largely changed the conflict of interest framework for local government in Victoria. So thank you, and over to you, Julie.
Thank you, David. Thank you for welcoming me so warmly. And I'm really excited to be here today speaking to all of you. Good morning, everybody. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land in which we are meeting, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and the Aboriginal elders from other communities who may be here today, so welcome. I'd also like to acknowledge Adam Fennessy, Kate Radigan, Robert Hocking and Michael Stefanovic that are here today, and also a special warm welcome from me to the CEOs from local government that are here today. It's really great to be here for this webinar session. And what I'm hoping to do is really provide a high-level overview of the Local Government Act conflict of interest changes and a couple of examples of some things that I've seen in the past, and some introduction to some work that we've embarked upon at Local Government Victoria, which you might find quite interesting, that actually is away from or separate from the Local Government Act conflict of interest provisions. So firstly, I just wanted to say that I have a great passion and a commitment to the local government sector, having spent 32 years working in it. and helping communities to thrive. And so whenever I see reports or anything that raises concerns about conflicts of interest that haven't been handled properly by councils, my heart sinks. And I think, what is it that we can do better to improve on this? And so, because of that, my role working in local government Victoria is more of a policy role, looking at, well, how else can we improve and support the sector going forward in things that we know that are challenging for them. So I've been in LGV now for 3 months, and I'm learning not only about the local government sector as a whole, but also the workings of Victorian public service. So I really valued Adam's presentation this morning, because I'm on that steep learning curve. I'm a proud advocate for councils and what they deliver, and I must plug the great work that councils are doing at the moment at helping people at that grassroots level, because you often hear in the media about negative stories about local government, but I can tell you local government are doing some great work. And as Executive Director of Local Government Victoria, as part of the Department of Jobs, Precincts and Regions, I'm committed to delivering some key outcomes to actually support the sector. So what we do is we connect the sector through pathways like CEO forums, and we support the sector through workshops and seminars, providing information and supporting the Local Government Act implementation. We share information and advice with the community and the larger sector groups, like the Local Government Mayoral Advisory Panel and the Gender Equality Advisory Committee. And we support outcomes such as collaborative working across the sector, for example, in events such as emergencies. And we know that we're in the COVID-19 pandemic still, and restrictions have presented many challenges for councils and communities over the past year. And the response from councils and the sector in total has been fantastic. So I just wanted to acknowledge that up front, because it really has been a major contribution. So we can't lose sight of that in all of these things that we hear about around things that let the sector down, particularly around conflict of interest. So councils assumed significant responsibilities, and they continue to build on those responsibilities from year to year. And COVID has shown over the past 18 months that it's been very, very difficult, not only dealing with the challenges of day-to-day operations, but things like COVID-19 and the bushfires. So it is a tough gig, and we recognise that. And I just wanted to acknowledge that at the start. Not only have the councils gone through this incredibly challenging period of time, they've also had another election cycle with a substantial amount of new councillors that have been inducted into local government. And with that, council staff have worked very, very hard in implementing their induction programs for those councillors, and also implementing the Local Government Act. So closer to home, council culture and councillor behaviour has been a strong focus for the sector. And in the new Local Government Act also, this has been an area of focus for my team, particularly over the last 12 months. And over the next 6 months is going to continue. We've recently also announced an independent study into factors that impact on culture in councils. And I'll talk to you a little bit about that, because it's very, very relevant, I believe, to all of this that we're talking about today. I believe it's not just about legislation, but it's also about behaviour, and it's about trust, as Adam talked about just before. So speaking now of the summit's theme for today, corruption, prevention, integrity, insights, I believe this is a really important topic to cover, and one with everything else we have had going on in times, sometimes has been overlooked. To some of you today, this will be relevant. For some of you that are experts in this field, living and breathing this every day, this will be bread and butter for you. For some of you, this will be new. So whilst many of you don't work in local government, I think the insights to the Local Government Act conflict of interest provisions will not be unfamiliar to you. There's a lot of work that we've been doing at Local Government Victoria, which has touch points with corruption, prevention and integrity. In fact, most work that Local Government Victoria touches on is an important topic, especially the Local Government Act implementation and the mechanisms in this important piece of legislation to prevent corruption and foster integrity. Because really that's what it's all about. It's about fostering integrity and building that trust within the communities, as Adam also spoke about. So what is the role of local government in managing conflicts of interest? Well, firstly, I'd like to talk about the role that LGV plays in supporting councils to understand their legislative requirements and responsibilities. So LGV supports councils to understand and meet the conflict of interest requirements in a number of ways. So, and they administer the Local Government Act, ensuring currency and communication to the local government sector changes, including conducting information sessions. We've had a number of information sessions now with local government, and we will continue to support local government in doing that. So local government needs to just reach out if there is a need for any more of that. We're more than supportive in doing that. And we do partner with councils and local government peak bodies to develop and implement evidence-based policy, programs and projects that strengthen councils' organisational, financial and governance capabilities. And we also produce guidelines through consultation with the sector, and we did produce some guidelines after the introduction of the Local Government Act 2020, and that's called In the Public Interest, and that's available on the Engage Vic website, so you can access that if you'd like to have a look at that. And that's a guide specifically for councillors, delegated committee members and for council staff, so please reach out and have a look at that if you haven't already done so. We also work with councils to collect and report information about council performance. And we respond to council queries about conflict of interest. And sometimes that is a little bit difficult for Local Government Victoria, because often with some of this, it is, it is interpretation. There's got to be a decision made by an individual to decide whether or not they feel that they have a conflict of interest, as has talked about before. There are provisions there, and sometimes there is need for understanding the legal implications as well. So we do play an interesting role in providing advice, but not always able to give, obviously, legal advice. And at the end of the day, it becomes the responsibility of the individual to make a decision about whether they believe they have a conflict of interest based on the advice that they have been given and their own knowledge of their own situation. So we administer the councillor conduct framework, which provides a clear hierarchy for the management of councillor conduct issues. And we have supporting ministerial oversight of governance issues. And I know that our minister is very interested in watching or observing and interested in finding out more about any governance issues that are happening across the sector. And we also circulate and highlight integrity body reports and guidance to the sector as well. That's really important. That's been referred to this morning also. So these are just some of the ways that LGV actually supports the sector in this area. And I encourage you all to reach out at any time you feel that you need some more support in this area, and we will see what we can do to assist you. So let me turn to the Local Government Act, because as you know, things did change with the new Local Government Act. And it was a big project for all of us to gradually implement this. And we're near the three-quarter mark of the implementation of the Act now, which is great. And in developing the Local Government Act, LGV took an extensive consultation engagement process over a period of 4 years with the local government sector and the broader Victorian community to ensure the new Act's provisions met the needs and were understood by the sector. So the Local Government Act includes a new regime for the management of conflicts of interest. These requirements came into effect from the 24th of October 2020. And the guidelines that I mentioned before are were actually introduced in October. So they are the most recent and up-to-date guidelines around the new provisions. So during the implementation of the Local Government Act, LGV worked with the local government sector, including its peak bodies and local government inspectorate, to develop and roll out guidance materials that aids councillors, council staff and members. And that's what I'm talking about. That's really important that you refer to that. And it's also the Act, as you know, has changed the way that we manage conflicts of interest. So the conflict of interest regime in the Local Government Act 1989, as you know, was complex and spanned 26 pages and 17 separate sections and 7 classes of interest. It identified the key scenarios that gave rise to a conflict of interest. So the intent was that the conflict of interest regime under the new Act was to move from a compliance test to one which is a principles-based approach with personal integrity and transparency in public office as foundations. And that's really important to remember, that it's now principles-based and it's now about personal integrity and transparency in public office. And what I want to do is just take you through those main changes that were included in the Act. So the definitions that some of you would know, that the definitions of conflict of interest have been simplified to include two types of conflicts of interest, and that's material and general conflicts of interest, based on the legislative framework in the Queensland and South Australian jurisdictions. And this supports a proactive approach to identifying a broader range of interests. So a relevant person has a material conflict of interest when an affected person would gain a benefit or suffer a loss depending on the outcome of the matter. So I'll say that again, an affected person would gain a benefit or suffer a loss depending on the outcome of the matter. An irrelevant person will have a general conflict of interest in a matter if an impartial, fair-minded person would consider that the person's private interests could result in that person acting in a manner that is contrary to their public duty. So you heard Adam talk about before about a fair-minded, reasonable person, and it's no different in the local government legislation. So thinking about it from a fair-minded person, a member of the public who might perceive there to be a conflict of interest by a person in a particular situation, that could be considered as a general conflict of interest. So that's the onus that we have now as individuals to make that decision about whether there is a conflict of interest in that particular case. So decision makers are required to disclose the conflict of interest and exclude themselves from any decision-making process in relation to that matter, including any discussion or vote on the matter at any council meeting or delegated committee, and any action in relation to that matter. This is broader than the requirements of the 1989 Act, which limited the circumstances in which a person with a conflict of interest must exclude themselves to voting on a decision. And I just reflect on a question that was asked of me when I was a CEO from a councillor, a new councillor, that said to me, I have a conflict of interest in this, but can I still sit in the chamber and watch and listen to the debate that's going on, the decision that is made? And I remember providing advice to that CEO, that councillor at the time, saying, well, you know, I think it might be better that you remove yourself altogether from the chamber, so then you can't be perceived to be influencing at all in any way. If you remove yourself completely, then there will be no question about whether or not you're trying to influence the decision that's happening in that room. So just an example of questions that do come up, and I know local government people face these all the time. To simplify and clarify the definitions of affected persons, thresholds for disclosable gifts, and exemptions from a conflict of interest and disclosable arrangements. That's now been included in the Act, and you can refer to that, and there are exemptions that need to be looked at. And again, our public interest resource provides you details around that. There are actually now in the Act also stronger sanctions for a breach of conflict of interest. For example, the CMI may apply for a councillor conduct panel to make a finding for serious misconduct, and you'll hear about that no doubt today. If an adverse finding is made, that councillor may, among other sanctions, be suspended for up to 12 months. So more serious sanctions now that are in there, which I believe have been welcomed by the sector. As you can see, these were all very needed changes, which add good clarity for us in terms of managing, addressing conflicts of interest. But time will tell, I think. Time will tell how the implementation of the Act is going, and we will continue to listen to feedback from the sector around how that is going and how successful the legislative change is. So First of all, secondly, I wanted to talk to you about challenges for councils in adapting to the new Act. So implementing change is not without its challenges, and we respect that. And I encourage you to all continue to work with us in implementing this robust legislation, which will ensure integrity and transparency in our sector. The Act brings with it the new category of a general conflict of interest, which will require relevant persons to carefully consider their interests from the perspective of an impartial, fair-minded person. At times, this may require advice. Where appropriate, relevant persons may also seek assistance from the Council's Chief Executive Officer or staff authorised by the CEO. And I know that there's some governance officers that are on the line today, and I know that you get caught in this, and I know that you are often involved in providing advice back to people in your organisation. Lawyers and other suitably qualified people are also very critical, and I know that when I was working in the sector, we had some great support from some eminent lawyers across Victoria who help and have a lot of experience in this space. We can also call on the MAV for support, the Victorian Local Governance Association, and also our integrity bodies, as we talked about before. So the relationship between personal interest returns and conflicts of interest is not always well understood. The effective management of personal interest can support the identification of conflicts of interest. Further changes to the conflict of interest regime may arise in response to Operation Sandon. Responding to the findings and the recommendations of Operation Sandon, particularly in relation to managing conflicts of interest in planning framework, will require strong engagement with the sector. I suppose what I'm doing is just flagging for you up front that with various reports that do come up, there's going to need to be strong focus from the sector on what we do to improve on how we're operating. And there are robust new requirements around managing conflicts of interest in the new Act, including the conflict of interest provisions. But I am excited to tell you about a new project that we've commenced working on recently in LGV that is going to go a long way to improve integrity and transparency. And it's about leading good governance. And LGV's Leading Good Governance in Local Government project is designed to support culture of good governance across the sector. We want to ensure that the sector is diverse, inclusive, and representative of the communities that it serves. And importantly, we want to empower the sector to improve standards and culture to minimise the need for state government intervention at councils. The project is designed to start a conversation about what the sector can do to support positive workplaces, improving trust in local democracy, and enhancing sector performance. A project will involve the development of a discussion paper using research and insights from the sector. And the sector will be engaged in the development of the discussion paper, including through workshops and the ability to make submissions. Good governance is about more than just meeting legal requirements. We all realise that. And it requires a strong focus on building a positive culture through some basic foundations, like creating respectful work relationships, understanding one's responsibilities, and resolving any issues early to prevent poor or toxic culture from developing. One great recent example is Stonnington Council, which created a mutual respect charter listing rights and responsibilities of the community, councillors and staff in all council-related interactions. So I hope that we can all be proactive and embrace the driving themes of the new Local Government Act, including transparency, accountability, democratic representation, and community engagement. And I'm hoping that this work that we're going to be doing will help raise awareness and help bring a better understanding for us at the state government level of what we can do to assist local government in ensuring that continues to improve. I just want to share with you just some very simple examples of conflict of interest now, just to finish up my presentation. So the first example is around a planning permit. The council is considering a planning permit that seeks approval to construct a multi-unit dwelling. Sounds familiar, I'm sure, to a lot of you in local government. The application for the permit has been lodged by Councillor A, who owns the land. Councillor A is an affected person under the Act. Councillor A may have a material conflict of interest because she appears to stand to gain benefit if the permit is approved. Approval to construct a multi-unit dwelling is a direct, non-pecuniary benefit, as it may result in an improved lifestyle for Councillor A. If the value of the land increases because of the approval, Councillor A may gain a direct pecuniary benefit. She must disclose a conflict of interest and exclude herself from decision-making processes. As you can see, these matters are often complicated, and it's very important to make sure that all conflicts of interest are managed and direct. The next is about community grants, something that commonly comes up with councils. A delegated committee of council is scheduled to vote on community grants. Staff member A is a member of a delegated committee and an ordinary member of a local tennis club. Does it sound familiar? This tennis club has applied for funding to refurbish its rooms. Staff member A may have a general conflict of interest because an impartial, fair-minded person may consider that staff member A's membership could result in him acting in a manner that may be contrary to his public duty. He should declare the conflict of interest and exclude himself from the decision-making process. So as you can see, these matters can often be managed by making sure we all fill in the paperwork, complete and lodged, and that we exclude ourselves from the process. The final example is about employment and income, secondary employment and income. The council is considering tenders for a road construction project with a final contract to be awarded by the council. Staff member B has been asked by her manager to be on the tender evaluation panel for the project. She is also a regular subcontractor for a company who has tendered for the project. Staff member B may stand to gain a benefit if the company is awarded the tender and subcontracts work to her. Were she to participate in the tender evaluation panel, a material conflict of interest may arise if she participates on the panel, as it appears that her private interests as a regular subcontractor of the company may result in her acting in a manner that is contrary to her public duty. If she hasn't already done so before agreeing to be on the panel, it appears that staff member B should declare a conflict of interest in relation to the company and follow the procedures outlined in the staff code of conduct. That was a complicated one, but we have seen it happen before. And as you can see, things are not always clear-cut as they appear on the surface, which is why it's important to always look at these matters with a risk-adverse lens. So more recently, the release of the Victorian Ombudsman's report into Melton City Council provided an unfortunate real-life example of why identifying and managing conflicts of interest is important. The subject of the Ombudsman's investigation was a well-paid senior member, the IT staff of a busy metropolitan local council for over 2 years. While there, he was able to direct over $1 million of IT work to one of his own companies using other companies. He influenced to provide additional unfavourable quotes to give the appearance that procurement rules have been satisfied. Look, I think there's a lesson in all of this for us, and I think that we do need to look at these things really carefully and learn from them as a sector. And we take these issues really seriously with Local Government Victoria, and we will assist the sector to deal with issues like this. And we, again, reach out to you to say we are here to assist you if you'd like our assistance in any of these particular issues. So as you can see, we must remain vigilant and ensure that through all of our processes that we are transparent, not only at state government level, but also at local government level. And there are clear legislative requirements now in place, and there is clear guidance now for you to refer to help you in your roles. It is not easy. I do accept and appreciate that. But I think at the end of the day, we need to really look back at why is this in place? And we've heard a little bit about that this morning. So in conclusion, managing conflicts of interest and championing integrity in everything we do, particularly in the local government sector, is important. Councils should be representative of their communities and serve in the best interests of the local people. The new Act and actions the sector is taking to improve council processes and culture is going a long way to achieve this across Victoria. I'm so pleased that I was able to speak to you today and just re-emphasise to you how important all of this is and update you on the important new mechanisms in place to manage these conflicts of interest. So please, again, reach out if you need to, always here to help. But let's make this sector, the local government sector, have the recognition that it deserves, because there is great stuff that the local government sector is doing, and it really does not need to be lost in amongst other things that are happening that bring the sector down. We want to celebrate what an amazing job the local government sector does for our communities across Victoria. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Julie. Wonderful presentation. Covered some very complex matters, and just to put in context, the transition from quite a prescriptive piece of legislation that drives local government to a more enabling piece of legislation is significant. The 79 councils around Victoria had to deal with a number of issues in that change, not in the least the changes to the conflict of interest provision, which affect the 640 plus councillors around the state and the 50,000 odd employees of local government. So quite a monumental change, shift in the way the legislation works and the way it must be applied across the sector. So well done. And one of the comments that came through was to congratulate LGV on the consultation process through the implementation of the legislation. So your work has been acknowledged. We've got time for one question, and it sort of crosses over your work and the integrity space, and we might flesh it out a little bit further towards the end of the session. The question was around councils self-regulate the risks and issues, including associated complaints around conflicts of interest. The challenge some councils face is that those matters are politicised, and council and staff can engage in groupthink to dismiss the reported conflict of interest matters. So from your perspective, what can be done to mitigate that as a risk in itself and remove this as an integrity barrier?
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. And I think that, you know, this comes back to the culture, I think, of the organisation and what people that work in local government, not only the staff, but also the councillors, are prepared to accept as in this space. I think that, where things become politicised, it is very, very difficult. And it's not something that staff can necessarily control. So don't try and control the politics, because it's not something that you're ever going to be able to do. I think the complaints need to be brought to the attention, I think, obviously, and they are, of those people that have those leadership roles with the CEO, with the mayor, etc. And then there needs to be, and there will be, processes in place to bring that to the attention of those people that are party to that. But I think that, again, it becomes, when people are talking in that question about groupthink, I think that goes back to the culture of the organisation and how much of the culture enables people to call those behaviours that are not appropriate, that are not necessarily that are not in line with the legislation, but are heading in that direction. Let's cut it off before it gets to a point where that conflict of interest occurs. Let's be confident. Let's build the confidence, say, of councillors to call another councillor and say, hey, you know, have you really thought about this, you know, before you go in and participate in that. You know, we need to be able to build the confidence of those councillors to be able to call that early on, so it doesn't occur and it doesn't bring the council down as a, as a local government authority. They need to be confident to do that. And I find that sometimes councillors do lack that confidence because they're worried about what the consequences are going to be for them in that relationship that they have with that other councillor. So, but I think if we build a culture of saying, hey, it's okay to talk about these things and call them out, then hopefully that will help manage the relationships going forward, because that's often what it is that drives local government people are those relationships. That's one of my views. Yeah, I don't know whether you have any views around that.
Oh, look, I do. Yeah, look, I do, but I do like your approach to that answer was really good. I think that the theme around building confidence for people to actually intervene early and prevent the integrity system having to become involved is a really important theme of your answer. So thank you for that. Look, we've run out of time for your session. Please stay around. No doubt there'll be more local government questions at the end of the webinar. And just in your presentation, you did mention our Operation Sandon, which is IBAC's investigation into the former City of Casey councillors and some of their activities. The focus of that investigation is around the integrity of decision-making, donations, lobbyists, and ultimately conflicts of interest. And we're hopeful of finalising that and producing some material towards the end of this year, the end of the calendar year. So moving on, what I want to do now is formally introduce our next speaker. The next speaker is Kate Radigan, Deputy Secretary of the Department of Education and Training. Kate leads a group of approximately 500 staff who provide direct support and advice to more than 1,500 Victorian government schools and the department's central and regional offices, so a combined workforce of over 80,000 staff. Kate's group leads in integrity, legal services, audit and assurance, communications and media, human resource, occupational health and safety, school engagement and compliance, principal health and wellbeing, operational policy, as well as executive, parliamentary and ministerial services. A really broad range of important portfolios under her leadership. Kate has a bachelor's degree in law and a master's in employment and in labour relations from the University of Melbourne. And in 2018, she became a top 50 public sector women award recipient. Kate will share the department's experience and response to IBAC's Operation Betka, focusing on the identified corruption vulnerabilities, particularly relating to conflicts of interest and the resulting actions taken by the department. Thank you, and over to you, Kate.
Thank you, David. Thanks for inviting me to speak to you all today about our experience with conflict of interest in the Department of Education and Training. I'd first like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the people of the Kulin Nation and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging and Aboriginal people here today. So I'd like to share with you some of the work that the department has done to build the capability of our really diverse workforce and in being able to identify and manage conflicts of interest as they arise in a range of different contexts. First, I'll give you a quick overview of the department and provide some context, and then I plan to take you through some of the key activities that we've undertaken over the last few years in the area of conflict of interest. So this slide here that hopefully should be on your screen gives you an idea of the size and the breadth of the department. We have responsibility for funding and oversight of education from early childhood through to tertiary education, and also we operate Victoria's 1,500 plus government schools. So our workforce is well over 75,000 in the teaching service, and they are largely a really dedicated and professional group of educators and very passionate and about providing good, strong educational outcomes to students and young people in Victoria. We also have more than 4,000 public servants in the department, and they're in the corporate and regional offices, and they support our frontline staff. So our workforce is spread out across the state, and we also have 23 regional offices. So the system that we run, the Victorian government school system, it gives a lot of autonomy and devolved authority to schools. So school principals and their school council members, so about 18,000 school council members, they make local recruitment and they make local procurement decisions. In terms of budget, last year the department spent over 14 billion, so that's a significant budget, and the majority of that goes towards school operations and school staffing. But in addition, the funding goes towards the government's commitment to build 100 new schools between 2019 and 2026. So the procurement activity associated with that ambitious building program is one, obviously, that we need to be aware of in terms of any conflicts of interest and risk that could be created there, as with anything. So it's within this context of our geographically and functionally diverse department that we've developed policies, and we've got monitoring and engagement activities, all in relation to conflict of interest that I want to talk to you about today. Next slide, please. So on this slide here, this takes you on our sort of significant integrity journey that many of you will be aware of since 2015. So I might start there in relation to IBAC in 2015. So IBAC published its Operation Ord report, which followed days of public hearings that exposed corrupt conduct in our department at senior levels of the organisation. And this operation focused on senior department officials who misappropriated department money by essentially banking it in schools and subsequently using the money for their own benefit to pay for inappropriate expenses such as excessive hospitality, travel, personal items. And this was also done through false and inflated invoicing, amongst other strategies. In 2016, Operation Dunham followed, and that was another IBAC inquiry and report, and that also highlighted a range of serious issues. Operation Dunham investigated the conduct of department officers in connection with the Ultranet, which was an online learning portal, and that looked at how contracts around the Ultranet were tendered and awarded, and looked at conflicts of interest that arose in connections between department employees and businesses that were involved in the Ultranet project, and also the payment of gifts and other benefits for people who are involved in that process. So those two reports in 2015 and 2016 provided us with this unprecedented burning platform for systemic reform, essentially. The then secretary at the time, Jill Callister, she made more than 100 public commitments, which formed the basis of kind of comprehensive integrity reform program that we've been implementing in our department. So we organised these commitments through essentially using a 3 lines of defence risk management model. So we sort of focused on, and we heard about that earlier this morning, around focusing on the conduct and the culture in an organisation. So we focused on that, reinforcing ethical conduct of leaders and staff, establishing that really strong integrity culture. And part of that was providing staff with an opportunity to make confidential or anonymous complaints through an outsourced service provider. And so that sort of first line of defence and those elements of it are so important in any, building sort of the right systems and processes and culture around integrity prevention and management. The other sort of second line action that we took was looking at our processes and our policies, and that is really critical for second line monitoring and compliance of policies. And then third line of defence, we've been focusing on our audit system, so implementing a really robust and independent auditing program, and we've changed that substantially since the issues that IBAC identified first came to light. So one of the processes that we identified through this first, second and third line of defence was that needed strengthening was conflict of interest management. And previously, declarations of conflict of interest were made directly to an employee's manager, and there was an essential record of those. So in 2018, we released an online declaration form, and that's embedded in our payroll system. So that it enables our employees to record declarations and to develop management plans that they can put onto that system and then seek approval for it. So with that system that we developed, that online form, we also implemented a far-reaching awareness-raising campaign and training and support to promote the form and remind staff of their obligations around conflict of interest management. Next slide, please. So with this improved electronic system for declarations in place, we then looked at targeted approaches for particular cohorts in our workforce. So the first cohort that we focused on was school principals. Principals are extremely busy people and very passionate educators. And in most cases, any failure to declare or properly manage a conflict reflects or has reflected a misunderstanding of their obligations. But in a small number of cases, there have been examples of principals misusing their position to benefit themselves or their family. The Victorian Ombudsman's investigation report into Bendigo Southeast College that was published in 2018 highlighted one of those cases. You can see from the slide that a number of key roles in the school were held by the principal's family members, such as, and that resulted in sort of personal interests influencing both recruitment and procurement decisions. In 2020, the Ombudsman published a further report that looked at case studies at 3 schools where principals' family members had been engaged through either casual employment or through procurement arrangements. And in that instance, the Ombudsman noted that these were well-intended, busy people, but they certainly got things wrong. Next slide, please. So school principal conflicts of interest have been a significant focus for us over the past few years. There have been challenges with addressing these issues, and I've sort of set them out on this slide here. And they kind of can be grouped into these kind of 3 areas. So autonomy. So schools operate with a large degree of autonomy, and principals have delegated authority for most decisions. The nature of conflicts of interest means that they can be blind to their own conflicts, and there has, as I mentioned, been limited oversight of these matters by the department. Conflict of interest in schools has primarily arisen in relation to staffing, but also in relation to procurement. So in that Bendigo Southeast College report, it was that sort of focus on the school principal seeing the school like a family business. So part of us identifying this as an issue, we really wanted to ensure that our messages about conflict of interest really reached the sort of target audiences. So we delivered tailored face-to-face training to each one of our principal networks. And we aim to ensure that each and every principal heard directly about the importance of understanding their obligations, but also about the impact that a failure to manage these issues has on the community in terms of their confidence in the school and the confidence in the system. And it really resonated, that direct training with very specific examples. The other challenge is around the diversity of the organisations and the workforces that we have in our department in such varied contexts. So we have schools in remote areas in rural and regional Victoria, where the schools sometimes only, there might only be 2 staff, and they may be people who live in the area. And then other times we have schools that are really large with hundreds of staff. So making rules that applied universally was complex. And so we had to do a lot of very, very specific and targeted work to ensure that it addressed all the different scenarios that we were dealing with. So we then required a piece of work that sort of applied policies and ensuring that people had a sound understanding of how to use the discretion that they had in their roles and as decision makers. But we're continuing to build the capability and the understanding of conflict of interest in the department. And it's also for managers. We're really focused on managers of people so that they can appropriately respond and oversee conflicts when they arise. History is another one of our challenges. So there's been a large number of established employees with relationships that give rise to conflict. And that's partly due to a really positive culture of families being in education, where many family members are in education, and that can be perceived or played out as favouritism in recruitment of family members. And so our engagement and our education work is focused on supporting school principals to see the issue from a different perspective. So to see it as one of, improving management practices to ensure fairness, to ensure transparency, and also to be really clear about merit-based processes. We've also recently used data analytics to help identify individuals with family members working in the same area, and that can lead to direct conversations with those people to ensure that those relationships are declared on our system, and then that there's a management plan in place for that. The impact of the work has been really positive. We've had school principals and any targeted cohort being really receptive to the work we've done and appreciated sort of the awareness raising and the systems that we've set up to support them. And we're now seeing a much more universal understanding of these obligations amongst school principals and specific workforces. And I think it's cascading through the system in a way that we had intended. Next slide, please. I wanted to also just mention contractors, because management of conflict of interest has not just been an issue confined to employment or confined to school principals. This area of contractors has been another area we've needed to build capability and address issues in our corporate workforce. So what we've done is we've used risk analysis to identify high risk areas, and that's where we've, say, targeting a program area that might have large or rapid growth of staff, particularly where they've joined the public sector from private industry, such as construction or information technology. And we've also used to identify sort of high risk areas, agency investigation reports, so Ombudsman, IBAC, etc., and recommendations that have been made in those reports to identify issues and to drive awareness in our organisation. So in May last year, one of those reports that was particularly helpful for us was the publication of Operation Betka, and that highlighted corrupt conduct by a former contractor in the department. IBAC investigated allegations that this contractor, this project manager, used his position with the department to provide business opportunities to a company that he owned. So the company was engaged by the department to provide contracted staffing resources between 2003 and 2016. IBAC's investigation identified that the project manager used his position in the department to further his private business interests, and he did that in a way that gave rise to a conflict of interest with his public duties. This involved misusing departmental information. It involved influencing processes for procuring contracted staffing services, and then getting around and circumventing those processes to get an unfair advantage over other IT contractors and suppliers. IBAC identified that the project manager had verbally and he had informally declared his conflict of interest to some department managers, but he didn't do that formally. And there were also occasions where he should have, but he did not formally declare the conflict to people who were unaware of his connection to the company. The conduct identified in the report ceased in 2016 when it was identified by the department and when we referred it to IBAC. As we've discussed, there was a lot of change in the department around that time. Obviously, that was after the IBAC hearing, the second hearing where we identified the issues with the Ultranet. And so we're in the process of building a number of systems and processes and updating policies and looking at our governance and risk structure, and also our culture. And it was all happening at that time where the report came out. And so we've then since then undertaken a number of projects to address the findings in that matter, and I thought I might outline what they are. So the things that we have introduced since that report include contractor induction improvements, so emphasising the importance of compliance with obligations, and we've got a department's contractor welcome kit, so we've reviewed that and revised it to improve awareness of conflict of interest obligations, and also creating more awareness of the internal processes that are available to declare conflicts of interest. We've introduced a declaration of conflict of interest form that's to be completed by labour hire who are being considered for work in the department. Hiring managers are then advised of any declarations as part of that sort of screening process. We've increased guidance and support for managers, and that's aimed at raising awareness of their obligations to maintain oversight of conflicts of interest of the employees that they manage. And we've got targeted conflict of interest training that we do for managers, for employees, and also for contractors in areas where there is a high number of contractors. Next slide, please. Conflict of interest remains the most significant integrity issue for the department, and we're continuing to do a lot of work in this space in relation to all areas of conflict of interest. This work includes the sort of items headlined on this slide, The first is that we're continually refreshing and consolidating our policies and our guidance. We've developed guidance and resources for staff, and I think as a result of that updating and refreshing that guidance, our staff understanding of the issues has significantly matured. And I think that does create its own challenges for us in ensuring the material is always current, that it's accessible and that's not overwhelming for users. And often, conflicts of interest arise in relation to decisions that are already governed by other policies. So recruitment, procurement, gifts, benefits and hospitality, other employment, etc. So what we have been really vigilant about is ensuring that those other policies direct decision makers to the conflict of interest policy, and that the guidance and the advice is consistent across the policies. So that's a continued focus for us. The second area has been around building capability. We aim to deliver 3 different types of conflict of interest training across the organisation, and we've worked out that it's much better to have the kind of bespoke approach. So we do general training, and that's to introduce the concepts, ensure that all staff have a shared understanding of the fundamentals of the policy, and we deliver that through an e-learn module as part of induction, and then also we do that periodically during employment. The second area is we deliver tailored training, and that's tailored training that's targeted to specific cohorts to address particular complexities of conflicts that arise in their area. So that might be school principals. It could be in relation to areas where staff are working in international students, where staff are supporting allied health staff, so psychologists and social workers and other allied health professionals who might be part-time and have other work in private industry. And we really tailor it specifically to those people who are working in areas that might present risks. And then the third is we provide a special training for managers, and that's for those who are responsible for considering declarations of conflict of interest that staff undertake, and also that they're the managers that the people that approve the management plans as well. So we do training for them to help them to understand what to look out for. So the feedback we've had on this training, it shows us that it's really valuable to develop training for specific cohorts. What the feedback has told us is that people learn most when there's really specific case studies that help people identify conflicts that they wouldn't have otherwise have even identified, and to give them confidence that it's about how they're managed. That's the crucial thing. Avoid first and then manage if can't be avoided. And that's in the case sometimes with school principals who are working in small schools in regional areas where family members are already working there. Conflict of interest scenarios can be quite complex and they may not have simple answers. So we aim to provide opportunities for staff in the training to kind of unpack case studies in detail, and we encourage people to share their experiences and to share the challenges that they've faced. Monitoring our policies is another area that the department is continuing to strengthen. And we're currently looking at ways to embed monitoring for conflicts into our business as usual. So like most things, this is an ongoing body of work, and it's unlikely that we'll ever be finished with our conflicts of interest work. I think it's important we keep the conversation going, and having a forum like today dedicated to conflict of interest is so important in that process. I think that's a key part of ensuring that we build and strengthen the culture of integrity across many organisations. Thank you.
Terrific, Kate. Thank you very much for that presentation. Some terrific material in that. And like all great forums, we're running a little bit behind schedule, so I've got time for one question for you. It's a great question, and it's one that I want all our presenters to think about, because we might circle back to it towards the end. But the question is, Kate, when an organisation has a broad remit and the potential for conflicts is expansive, how do we pitch the messaging to ensure we are capturing the right types of conflicts and not have staff feel as though they are caught up in endlessly registering minor matters to the point where we might miss the major ones?
Oh, look, that's such a good question. It's absolutely about tailored and specific messages. Not only that, but it's about modelling. So we've done a lot of work with our leaders in the department to model the right behaviours and to do sort of engage in storytelling as well about how they've managed conflicts and how they're supporting and managing others. Because we know that the tone is set from the top with this kind of thing. So having a leadership that's educated, aware, and have been trained is really important, I think, in setting expectations across an organisation, and then being really, really specific with staff members about what that conflict of interest is and how to manage it. And I think part of our communication has been to encourage people to ask questions. So if they're not sure, if it's a perceived and actual a potential conflict, to call us, to work it through with us, and that there's no harm in declaring something, putting it in our system and having a plan for it. There's no harm in that. That's in fact the right thing to do, and that we can provide advice and support to help people to identify how serious it is and what are the strategies that need to be in that management plan to manage those risks.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Kate. Appreciate that response. What we might do is move on to the next phase of our forum. But before we do so, I just want to acknowledge that Kate and her area and the department, their response to a number of IBAC investigations has been significant. The way they've structured their integrity services and embedded integrity champions across all of Victoria in various business units has been terrific. And if other departments are looking at opportunity to improve the way they have and deliver their integrity services, then you might want to call on Kate's areas, and rather than reinvent the wheel, they've done a lot of the hard work already. So a shout out to your group, Kate, well done. Okay, I want to move on to now the next interactive part of the forum. And this is where we'll present several conflict of interest scenarios and discuss them with our panellists. Our panellists for this session from the VO, I welcome Rob Hocking, who's the Assistant Ombudsman there. Rob's responsible for the oversight of all the major investigations conducted at that office. He's got extensive public sector experience working in oversight agencies both in Australia and in the UK. So we welcome Rob. And from the LGI, I welcome Michael Stevanovic. Michael was appointed as the new Chief Municipal Inspector and Head of the Local Government Inspectorate in April of this year. Michael's got extensive experience again in undertaking complex investigations and high risk environments, both within Australia and overseas. So what we'll do is we'll present the scenarios one at a time, and you'll have opportunity to participate by answering poll questions at the end of each scenario to see how you would handle each situation. And I encourage you to participate by responding to the poll questions in a pretty timely manner and with the device that you're using, and that will then allow us to assess the responses and discuss the outcomes. Please note these aren't real examples, but are based on the themes and issues that we come across in all of our agencies. And what we'll do is we'll share the poll results and discuss the key issues and considerations at play in each scenario and draw on our panellists' knowledge. What I'll do is also remind you that you can also submit questions at any time via the Q&A function ahead of our audience Q&A, and then we can run those past the presenters towards the latter end of the forum. So let's move on to scenario one. So the first scenario is you're a councillor at a regional local council and you're on the committee allocating grants to local community groups for building works. One of the grant applications comes from a local football club seeking an upgrade to the gym facilities used by the senior players. Your children play at the junior league for the local football club, but do not use these gym facilities. So we'll go to our poll questions. And what I'll say is we don't expect you to know the workings of the local government legislation, but it's important. I think Julie alluded to it. There's a test in the Local Government Act about what a fair-minded person would think or do. So what we'll get you to do is apply that fair-minded thinking in response to the questions. Okay, the first question is, what are the next steps you could take? Should you remove yourself from the grants committee? Should you declare a conflict of interest to the committee or to the committee chair and together identify a management plan that does not require you to leave the committee and ensures the committee's decision regarding the football club's application is made without your influence? or should you take no steps? There's no conflict of interest that could arise, as neither you nor your children use the gym facilities and you're able to act without bias. So that's the first round of questions. The next round of questions relate to the next steps you would use to manage the conflict of interest. Would they be different if the council had no current contact with the local football club, but they used to have contact a few years ago? You can see the responses are flooding in, which is terrific. And the third question is, would the steps to manage the conflict of interest be different if instead the councillor, if it was instead a council employee, not a councillor, who was a panellist, and this employee had a connection to the local football club through their children? Would that pose a different set of circumstances? And that's again a yes/no question. So what we can see is the responses coming in, which is great. And again, applying that fair-minded person test, not needing to have an understanding of the local government legislation around conflicts of interest. But what do you think a fair-minded person would expect? Okay, we'll give it a couple more seconds. We've got quite a few people that are still voting. Okay, we might flip up now to the poll results and see what the audience think in relation to these questions. So for the first question, what steps should you take? So 15% of the respondents thought it would be appropriate to remove yourself from the grants committee. The vast majority of response, so 82% of the respondents said it was appropriate to declare the conflict of interest to either the chair or to the committee and identify a management plan that doesn't require you to leave the committee. And then we had a small number of respondents said there was no steps to be taken as there's no conflict of interest. So very strong responses for the answer about declaring it and working out a management plan. So I'll throw over perhaps to Michael first, and just to see if that accords with your thinking in response to this scenario.
Yeah, thanks, David. Yes, I agree. My preference would be for the option there where they declare the conflict and then work out a plan to deal with it. I think option A, removing themselves from the grants committee entirely, is the sort of scorched earth option. It sort of then limits them from involvement in other elements of what the committee has to decide on. I think it is well and truly appropriate to declare it. Most conflicts of interest, and I think this is something we can take away from today, can be dealt with, and they should be dealt with. They need to be identified early, and I think this is a key example of that. That if it's identified early, it can be dealt with. Rob, any follow-up from you?
No, I certainly agree. I think that is the right answer in my view. I think really you find yourself in some ambiguous situations sometimes, and I think my advice would be to over-declare where you're not sure, and as Michael says, then put some management plan in place that's open and transparent, and you can come back to it at a later time if you're ever called on to justify what course of action you took.
So I think what this identifies is often there's a really clear-cut approach, and it's quite obvious in this instance that most people have sought the appropriate response from our perspective. The next question is really interesting, where would the steps to manage the conflict of interest be different if the councillor had no current contact with the local football club, but they used to have contact a few years ago? And there's almost a split between yes and no, almost an even split in terms of the responses there. So I wonder perhaps, Rob, do you want to comment on that first as to, is there a defined period of time when a conflict no longer exists and you don't have to be concerned about it?
I wouldn't say so, David. I think it's a case-by-case basis. You really have to turn your mind to it. But but also I think you need to be conscious of the perception of conflict of interest as much as anything, and put yourself in the shoes of other people who might be looking at your role and how they might consider it. And you know, relationships can persist over time, even when you've left a particular organisation, and you need to be mindful of that. Yeah.
And so, Michael, with your office, and if you're looking at a matter like this, do you look at the distance of time in terms of when a person might have had a close involvement with an entity and when they're in a decision-making role?
Yeah, it'll certainly be looked at. It's just a question of how much weight you would give to it. But again, it may well be an indicator. You know, people have relationships that go on for many years in different ways and different settings, and you know, they may have severed their contact directly with the club, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the relationships with the individuals behind the club aren't continuing in some other way. So we'd certainly we'd want to know more if we were presented with a scenario like this.
Indeed. And look, from your perspective, Michael and Rob, this would present as a fairly common sort of scenario, a decision maker like a councillor having an involvement in a community organisation. And then there's that real and material conflict of interest. Of course, we understand that, but it's more that perceived conflict where members of the community might see that that connection is quite strong and it's influenced their decision making. So from that perspective, it's important that the conflict is declared, that it is managed, and it is communicated to ensure the community have confidence in the decision making. And in some respects, it's probably more prevalent in regional areas where that connection with the community entity is more widely and well known. Would that be a reasonable comment?
I would tend to agree, although I would say that now with the advent of social media, I think it's turned even large metropolitan council areas into small country towns. I think the local government memory is now a lot more robust than what it used to be, and things from many, many years ago are now brought to the fore in local council elections and in matters that appear before us.
And the last part of the question was, would the steps to manage the conflict of interest be different instead if a councillor was in fact a council employee who was the panellist, and this employee had connection to the local football club through their children? And as you can see there, again, it's about 2/3, 1/3 in terms of whether it makes a difference. So perhaps I'll get you to comment on that one, Michael.
Not really. It's there's so many different ways in which a council employee could also, if they're, you know, have questions raised about their potential involvement or ability to influence something. It could be something to do with planning. It could be something about contract award. There's so many different ways in which a council employee could be drawn into something, and the safest option would be to declare that interest. Yeah.
And I think, as we've already said, it doesn't necessarily mean the existence of any corrupt conduct, but the association, it's appropriate that it is declared and it is acknowledged, so the decision making doesn't come under any adverse sort of comment or scrutiny. Rob, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about bias or unconscious bias in decision making, and how that might present as an issue for the community when they see people with connections to entities being involved in that decision making.
Yeah, we see a bit of situations where someone may find themselves on a panel. They might on a threshold identify that they may have a conflict, but they just don't see that the proximity to the conflict in themselves is that close. And so, you know, and sometimes the steps that are put in place to manage a conflict, even when it is identified, aren't sufficient. And what we see, for instance, is that sometimes a person will be on a panel but say, I want to ask questions, but I won't have a vote at the end of the process in the decision-making process. But the perception often of the other panel members is that they may be feeling influenced, particularly where there's a difference in power dynamic. You know, someone more senior than they are is on the panel but not voting. But you know, the unconscious bias, you know, it's something that you need to be constantly questioning yourself, and I think that's something that policies and procedures need to be, you know, promoting, that people need to be having those sort of conversations with themselves about the decisions that they're making, and the community are always watching. You know, it's public funds, whether it's procurement or recruitment. And so whether you're a councillor or whether a council employee, there will be scrutiny of the decision, and other people might feel differently to you, and you need to sort of think about how it might come across your involvement in a particular decision-making process.
Yep, thanks, Rob. And Michael, I'll throw to you just to wrap this scenario up. If a councillor doesn't declare a conflict of interest, what recourse is there? And in particular, you often receive complaints about this. What does it mean for the decision that's been made? Is there recourse for that particular decision?
Well, I'll start with the first component of that. And if a conflict of interest hasn't been declared, well, it's potentially an offence under the Local Government Act. There's specific offences for whether it's a material or a general conflict. Now, we can investigate that. Alternatively, we can also ask that a councillor conduct panel be impanelled to actually look at that and dealt with. And if they find a finding of misconduct against the councillor, then that person can be essentially struck off or disqualified from acting as a councillor for 12 months or so. Alternatively, we might decide, depending on the level of it, we might decide to do a full investigation, and especially where it might be in concert with other matters that have been raised that may cause us to look at other potential offences. But there's also the ability for us to go to make an application to VCAT where we think it might be a gross misconduct. And that might be where there's something particularly nefarious about the councillor's background that might cause us to want to take it to VCAT to look at getting a greater period of disqualification for that council member, up to 8 years. With respect to the decisions made, yes, it potentially could. It could leave council open to a matter of legal action. It could leave council staff open to having their decisions challenged. Now, the Ombudsman's Office, Robert can talk to this, but decisions, the planning decisions, other decisions like that, there's other avenues where they can take those concerns. If the ratepayer feels that some process wasn't followed, then they can appeal those as well.
It's certainly the case, Mick, and we receive complaints about decisions fairly regularly, and we look into them, and also there's the public interest disclosure mechanism as well. So when people feel that they're not heard within the council, there is the oversight option as well.
Indeed, thanks, Rob. There's an obscure section in the Local Government Act that talks about where a decision is made and there's a breach of an element of the Act. It doesn't necessarily invalidate the decision. However, there is case law where in the civil courts where a decision was overturned because of the bias issue, which is very similar to a conflict of interest. So the decisions generally stand as they are, but as Mick said, they are open to challenge if someone is predisposed to doing so. So it's a really interesting one, and one that does generate an awful lot of complaints to the integrity system around particularly council decision making. Okay, attendees, get ready again. We're going to run the second poll question. So get ready with your devices ready to enter in your responses. Okay, conflict of interest scenario number 2. So Sonia is a team leader for the IT division, and she's in an intimate relationship with Raj, who's a junior member of another team. Sonia does not currently have any direct reporting lines with Raj, but their teams do work closely together. Okay, so I'm going to go to the poll questions now. And the first one is, what are the next steps Sonia should take to manage any conflicts arising from this relationship? First response is no steps need to be taken. The relationship doesn't create any conflict of interest for either Sonia or Raj, as they have an indirect working relationship. Second response is declare that relationship to a supervisor and discuss how to monitor the situation and manage any conflicts. For example, Sonia never supervises Raj, or there is oversight if she must make decisions that affect Raj's career progression or development opportunities. Third response is Sonia should end the relationship. And the fourth response is Sonia or Raj should leave the entity to ensure no conflicts arise. So if you can get your responses in, I can see them flooding in now, which is great. There's some pretty strong responses here for one particular answer, which is terrific. It means it will be a very easy panel discussion. I'll give you a couple more seconds to enter your responses. Oh, and we'll go on to question, response number 2. My team have just reminded me. Sorry about that. So I'll move on to the next question as well. If Sonia decides to declare the relationship to a supervisor, does she have to advise the nature of the relationship? For example, is it that it is an intimate relationship? So your response opportunities there are yes, the information could inform the risk assessment and management for the conflict of interest, or no, that information is private and irrelevant to how the situation should be managed. So thanks for those that have already entered the responses for those questions, and my apologies for not scrolling to the bottom of the screen. Okay, we might go to the responses now. And overwhelming responses for the first question, and that is that Sonia should declare that relationship to a supervisor, discuss how to monitor the situation and manage any conflicts as they might arise. Michael or Robert, any opinions or views on that scenario and response?
No, my own personal view would be the second option there, declaring the relationship to the supervisor and working out an action plan. It's relationships of all kinds work when they work, and when they don't, they don't, and it can be calamitous if there's no awareness of that by the managers and a plan in place.
And Rob, is this sort of like a common complaint theme that you see, particularly with the new PID threshold of improper conduct in the workplace? Is this something that you've seen?
Yeah, we do see this quite regularly, particularly in the context of recruitment. It was very interesting, and the example that I'm thinking of is not of an intimate relationship, but relationships can form, children, as Kate pointed out, there could be principals who are hiring children and other people as well. The effect is quite significant on the confidence of other team members, and board of staff in an organisation. It can have a very serious effect on morale and confidence in the management. In Raj's situation here, if this conflict wasn't managed properly in terms of having appropriate arrangements in place for recruitment, so that Sonia's not on the recruitment panel. If you were to get the job, the Ombudsman had a report fairly recently with a quote along the lines of is that it just that perception of bias and the favouritism hangs over Raj for the rest of his career in that organisation, and everything that he does, he feels like he has to perform twice as well just to prove himself. So yeah, it's significant. Yeah.
Great, and so moving on to we've got quite an overwhelming agreement in terms of the approach for the first part of the scenario. The second question is a little bit more split, so it's 2/3, 1/3 thereabouts in terms of the importance of nominating the nature of the relationship, so that it is in fact an intimate relationship. So 2/3 of the respondents believe it's important information, and it really does impact on the information and how the conflict will be managed. And 1/3 thought it was private information and should be withheld. So I guess the first question is, what do we mean by intimate relationship? And is that important in terms of the information that a manager needs to determine how the conflict of interest should be managed? So Rob, I'm going to throw that tricky one straight to you.
Well, thanks, David. Fortunately, there's guidance that the VPS, Victorian Public Sector Commission, have provided, and it's a 2018 guidance, but it says consensual personal relationships include consensual, sexual, intimate, and/or romantic relationships between adults of any sex or gender identity. Relationships of this kind may be casual, periodic, or regular basis, and may or may not constitute a primary relationship. So, fortunately, there is some guidance that exists, and it's a piece of a document well worth looking at where one's unsure, and again, you might find and probably should have some policies within the organisation that you're in that identify what that is. But other than those sort of guidances, you also need to be kind of aware yourself. You need to have a think about what that might mean to you in terms of whether it is significant. I don't think necessarily. I mean, privacy is a consideration, and ultimately, you might, I don't think there's any compulsion on disclosing that it is an intimate relationship. But if you think it's relevant, as I said before, over-declare and the guidance that the Victorian Public Sector Commission gives talks about dealing with disclosures privately and keeping the confidence of those people. Is not necessarily an obligation to make your colleagues aware of the relationship, even if you do have to make a manager or the organisation aware of it.
Great. Thanks, Rob. That's a terrific response. And I think that document that you referred to is available on the VPSC website. And again, we might be able to share that to the attendees at the conclusion of the forum. Look, I might move on to the second part. There's two further questions in relation to this scenario. And the next two questions are, would the steps to manage the conflict of interest be any different if the relationship between Sonia and Raj was one of personal friendship and not intimacy? And you've got two options there. It's a yes, no. No, in terms of the exact type of the relationship, doesn't matter. It's the potential or perceived conflict of interest that is of concern. And the yes would be the management plan could change if the relationship is a friendship or an intimate relationship. So I'll get you into your responses to that one. I can see them flooding in. And the second question I have in respect to it is, what considerations are appropriate when deciding whether to declare a personal relationship in the workplace? Is it the duration of the relationship, the respective salaries of those in the relationship, or whether there's a direct or indirect working relationship or reporting line? Just give you a couple of seconds to enter in your responses. Again, thanks to everybody for entering those in. They're coming in swiftly, so I can see that we'll be able to deal with this one quite quickly. More seconds. Right, I think we're right to go. Okay, we will publish the poll results. So, very interesting result for the first one. Almost a dead even split in terms of whether the relationship between Sonia and Raj being either a friendship or intimate makes a difference. So I wonder, Rob, again, I'll throw to you and see if you've got a comment on this scenario question and the responses.
I would say no. I don't think it necessarily it makes a difference. People can have very strong friendship relationships, and sometimes we see people have identified that someone has had friends at a prior organisation, and the friends start showing up at the new organisation, and there isn't any kind of recognition that the person who has come across and these people start appearing has any relationship with them. Again, that goes to the confidence of the organisation in the fairness of recruitment processes and the merit-based processes. But certainly, I think from my perspective, no, it doesn't matter about that.
Yep. And so just a comment from you then, Michael, we're getting into that challenging space of how deep a friendship is one that creates or a perception or a real conflict of interest. So I wonder if you've got a comment on the responses.
Look, I sit right smack in the middle. I think it would be helpful for managers to know of those relationships because you can guarantee that over time your staff will figure it out where people have come from. Whether it involves a formal plan to deal with it or not, I'm not that clear on. But I think it's something you just have to, as management, you have to be across and aware of that for your own employment practices and those of people that report to you as well, that these things are taken into account. It all goes back again to the perception. It is a very fine line to tread when you start bringing in people that you've worked with before or have been friends of yours in other settings. So I can see why there's it's a largely 50-50 split here.
Yep. Absolutely. It's getting into the real grey area. And one of our attendees has sent in a terrific question around how does an intimate relationship differ from where you've perhaps played with a friend, played golf together every weekend for the last 20 years versus you've had one round of golf with someone you've just met. So how does that then sort of equate? Is there a consistent approach? And I think from our perspective and the discussions I've just picked up with the panel members is that it's a risk-based approach. It's looking at the information you have at hand around the declaration, working out whether firstly it is consequential if the relationship does have a material or a perceived impact, and then how is best to manage it. But it goes back to the question, I guess, that that we had for Kate before around reporting for reporting's sake. So do you want all your staff coming to you with every friendship relationship or potential conflict that they might have and creating that cycle of reporting for reporting's sake? Or are we wanting people to be really conscious and think about it and come to the ones we actually think might be in existence? So opposed to seeking advice versus actually the ones that have a material impact. What do you think, Rob?
Look, I agree wholly, David, and I was just sort of reflecting, that Kate made another point about the role of conflict of interest training probably never ends, and it's true. It's a constant conversation, and management and leaders within the organisation need to be open about their own and give scenarios about examples of where it's affected them, so that people feel confident and they know it's not simply that having a potential conflict of interest is the wrong thing. It's the management of that and the feeling of being able to communicate that through the correct channels and that the policy we were talking about before, for instance, indicates that you as an organisation you should have multiple abilities to report, different channels that you can report into. So if it is an intimate relationship, for instance, and you don't feel confident reporting it to your direct manager, you need another source to go to. Perhaps it's HR or someone else nominated that you can feel confident to do that with.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Rob. And look, I think the essence of that is when you're getting into the more unknown space, the grey space, then seeking that advice is really, really important. Having the discussions, and if it does need formal notification, formal declaration, then so be it. But seeking that advice in the first instance from experienced people within the organisation is really important. We've got time for one more scenario. So if all the attendees can get ready for this one, we'll run through a third conflict of interest scenario. So this one is a little bit more broad and board. It's a nice little segue. So you're on a board of a public sector agency tasked by government with delivering a significant infrastructure project before the next election. There are limited supplies of some of the materials required for the infrastructure project. An anonymous complaint is made to the board that the general manager for operations for the agency previously worked for one of the selected suppliers a few years ago. When queried about this allegation, the CEO confirms it is true and notes that the general manager has had other jobs in between the role at the supplier and their current one with the public sector agency. Due to this interval between roles and the tight delivery timeframes for the project, the CEO advises that the general manager has no formal conflict of interest declaration. Was not required. So the questions: how could the board respond to the CEO? First options are request the CEO seek a formal declaration from the general manager about a perceived conflict and develop a plan to manage the conflict and any risks that may arise from the general manager's connection with the supplier. Secondly, the board may not require anything as the CEO is responsible for the agency's employees and has the matter in hand, and it's more important the job gets done as the timeframes are tight, or dismiss the CEO and or the general manager. Three very stark options there. And we're getting the submissions in, and I'm seeing some pretty strong trends in response to this one. Again, this is an interesting scenario because it is one that comes up quite often across our desk, and I'm sure the Ombudsman as well. Given that major projects in particular are obviously important to the state, there's a small pool of people that have the expertise to deliver those projects. So often they have worked in the industry and around the industry. So it's not uncommon for these sort of issues to be raised. We've got a large body of responses in. I might cut that off now and we'll publish the results. So as you can see, very strong response, almost overwhelming, that it would be a duty of the board to request the CEO seek a formal declaration from the general manager about the perceived conflict and develop a plan to manage the conflict and any risks that may arise from the general manager's connection with the supplier. Rob, I might throw to you firstly to make a comment around this scenario. Firstly, it's not new, I would think, to your office, and perhaps the responses that were available.
No, and look, they are stark choices. I agree with the majority verdict, the resounding majority verdict there, and it is something that we see quite often, particularly decision making that's had to be made in a very expedient manner because of project deadlines are coming up. Sometimes, sadly, it might be represented as being an urgency that isn't actually there, when someone might be being deliberately naive about their conflict and trying to argue that it's in the necessity causes one to not follow the obligation to consider conflicts of interest and declare them. But what we find is that the board needs to be needs to be hands-on with those things and basically have a very open line of communication to the general manager, particularly the chairman or chairperson of the board, and policies need to be in place. But certainly, the clear message is regardless of the urgency, it's public funds, and often considerable public funds are being expended in procurement activities. And long after the urgency has gone away, the fact that a conflict of interest hasn't been considered or declared where it should have is something that exists about that and cast a shadow over public perception of the project. And also over the individual person's professionalism and as you were saying, David, the threshold of what constitutes misconduct is now serious professional misconduct in the context of public interest disclosures. So certainly one's decision making, if it could attract criticism in a disciplinary context, is something that might well fall within the remit of an oversight body such as ourselves to look into and determine whether or not a conflict should have been declared, whether or not there was other factors that were pushing things along.
And Michael, if you replace the government board with a council, and so you're now a council and you become aware of this, does it change the responses or the responsibility of what the councillor ought to do?
No, it doesn't. It needs to be declared and an appropriate plan put in place to manage it. But it also does, to me, raise questions about the CEO's judgment. So we probably could have had an option D there as well to address that. Clearly the CEO had an awareness of these things, and the advice that he gave is questionable.
Indeed, terrific. Thank you very much, gents, for the participation in the scenarios. We're going to move on now. We've got about 15 minutes left, and I'm going to move on to questions from our audience that are posed to our panel members. Just to update you, we've unfortunately both Julie and Adam have had to leave the forum due to some pressing requirements. So the panel is effectively Michael, Robert, myself, and I think Kate might be still there. We'll just check on that. No, Kate's had to go as well, unfortunately. So it's us. We are the panel, which is great. We should have some interesting discussions in any event. So I've got some questions that I'll now pose to you. Many of these were lodged on registration, and they're still excellent questions, and I want to try and work through as many as we possibly can. The first one is, what is a good framework to apply when considering perceived conflicts of interest? Something that's a little bit more robust than the pub test. I'll start with you, Rob. What do you think?
Look, I think context is very important in terms of the organisation and the activities that the organisation goes into. So Kate mentioned that the Department of Education and Training used a bespoke approach, and I think that's very, very true. You need to look at what the activities of the organisation are and what the public interface is, in order to realistically determine what might look like a perceived conflict of interest in the space of the organisation that you're in. For instance, regulatory agencies, they have particular clients, for want of a better term, and their activities might involve going out as inspectors. One of the things that you might find in that situation is that some industries have a very small pool of professional people who work within them, and there's crossover between the people in the private sector and people who become inspectors and vice versa. So the ability to have a strong guidance in place about what a conflict may look like and an ability to declare it is important. That's probably the main message I would say.
And Michael, going on with what Julie mentioned about the Local Government Act and the fair-minded person test, have you got some thoughts about the application of that and how that might affect a perceived conflict of interest?
Look, I think Julie in her presentation sort of made reference to the guidance material that the LGV now has on its website about the changes to the Act. And it is very detailed, and I plan to introduce it as training material for my office because it does set out with a high degree of detail what's required. But it doesn't take away from the fact that councils are still individually responsible for having their governance plans in place, their governance rules, and the conflicts of interest have got to be articulated in there. But how they're going to deal with those. So I think it's more prescriptive in there in terms in the Local Government Act as to what that there needs to be some proper guidance material that councils can refer to, and I think the LGV material plus council governance rules go to providing that level of clarity and training for councillors.
Thanks, Michael. And what I would add to that, in terms of a more robust model than the pub test, it's important to consider that the pub test does form one consideration, as does, we used to describe it as the front page of the paper test. But where you get the advice around the grey sort of areas around the perceived conflict of interest is a range of sources. It's within your workplace, it's your peers, it's the guidance material, it's a combination of all that forms your decision making. So it's important to, if you are thinking that a conflict might exist, or you are managing a conflict, that you get that information, that you consolidate it into your thinking, and then it informs your decision making. And if you can demonstrate that, if it then becomes a decision that is subject to scrutiny, it's far more defensible, and you can justify the outcomes if you made those considerations. So I'll move on to the next question. It's a really good one. It's a shame we don't have Kate with us. The question is, what's an effective way of setting up a centralised conflict of interest register comprised of recruitment, suppliers, personal relationships, and secondary employment? And it's a good question on the basis that as an integrity agency, we often have a complaint lodged with us. We look at and start to explore the actual elements of the complaint and find that conflicts are sometimes declared in pockets of the organisation, but then are not transferred across the broader organisation. So there's not a broad organisational awareness of either the individual conflict of interest or a compilation of conflict of interest across a range of different parts of the business. So I'm wondering, Rob, have you seen effective ways where organisations have set up systems to make sure that there is a centralised component? So if a conflict is declared, it's in one place and it can relate to a number of different facets of the work?
It's an interesting question too, and very well put. It often depends on the size of the organisation about how such an arrangement is managed. I have seen larger organisations may have a governance officer who manages that as part of that person's role, and we'll have a process in place and regular reporting requirements. So that, say, for instance, you have to renew your conflict of interest declaration every 6 months or a year, depending on what that is, and then that's updated into a central register. I think the other point made really well is it has to be sort of not in pockets, it has to be organisation wide. So that again comes from the leadership of whatever organisation of whatever size, and it needs to be kind of ingrained within individuals throughout the organisation. And one of the best ways we've seen that work is to make conflict of interest training part of the induction process, and have an easy access to making those declarations. Not overly complex forms and check boxes, etc., but a living awareness of the issue and ability, as we've talked about, that management are conscious of it and open about it, and then that there is an easy access to the centralised register to make those updated reports as they go along.
Yeah, excellent. And so, Michael, obviously this is complex in the local government space, particularly with councillors and their decision making and the perception of conflicts of interest. So is the process for the declaration and the recording public? So are people aware of it, and is it recorded within the council that those declarations have been made?
Yes, there is some public accounting of that. There's the councillors are required to do a number of returns as well, which show their financial connections, and that's done on a biannual basis. And that's done pretty well uniformly. We have a very high compliance rate on that. One thing I'll say though is it gets to sort of to Kate's point earlier about data analytics. It's all well and good to collect that, but if it's in silos and it's not being assembled with other information, or there's no ground truth to it, or tested in some way, then its usefulness, it may certainly be found during the course of a forensic discovery somewhere down track with an investigation, but ideally there should be some data analytics and some real-time assessment of the accuracy of the material that goes into those.
Yeah, it's a really interesting element to particularly council decision making around what's declared, what's available publicly, and of course that concern around privacy. So which one has the balance in terms of importance for the public office? And it's one question that's constantly evolving and being answered from an integrity perspective. I'll move on to the next question, and it's one for both the VO and the LGI, and it's how are integrity and public sector bodies keeping pace with the human factors influencing conflict of interest processes? Really interesting question. Rob, I might throw that one to you to start with.
Yeah, human factors is an interesting concept, and it is, people's understanding and appreciation of conflict of interest varies, markedly across the board. And obviously, I think Michael made a good observation earlier about social media, for instance. That as it evolves, people's relationships evolve in different ways, in terms of how they contact each other. And for instance, sometimes what we see is that pictures of somebody doing something with someone, like driving them somewhere, become evidence that's produced to us of a relationship, and we have to take that into the context of the real aspects of what's going on, and be quite pragmatic about what it really means, because the context of people's individual lives is something that we have to think quite carefully about before we make a decision about whether they're engaged in, say, for instance, serious professional misconduct, because it's such a significant question and impact on their own professional and personal life.
Indeed. And for you, Michael, the human factors in local government are very real because of the relationships and the requirement, particularly for councillors, to act as a Senate, act together and make decisions. How do you see your office and the system keeping pace with the changes in that dynamic?
Well, if I can just return to the reason we elect local councillors is to actually provide that, that local input, to push interests. We have people will run on a single ticket item for, they want a cleaner beach, or they want an extra dog walking park, or, they join for that reason. They join and they're elected for that reason. And it's really important to understand that, and to make sure that they understand that their roles go beyond that single ticket issue they got elected on, and that while they do have to participate in the training, they have to comply with the processes set by government for their returns and the like, and educating them as to what's expected. It's councillors here in Victoria aren't remunerated as a full-time job, so we expect a lot of them for fairly small compensation, and I think we need to keep those things in mind, that they may have joined for one purpose, but discover that they've walked into something a little bit bigger, and find ways to support them and not get in their way, and make sure that the governance processes are there for them to fall back on.
Thanks, Michael. I think we've got time for one more question, and it's almost typed in bold. The question is, what's the procedure when IBAC themselves decide not to investigate local government conflicts and pass the buck to others? Bit of a shouty question. Okay, so look, it is a good question, and it goes to our jurisdiction and our resourcing capability. So IBAC can't investigate everything that comes across our desk. Likewise with the Victorian Ombudsman, and likewise with the local government inspector. Our resourcing is finite, so therefore we have to put some analysis and assessment into the matters we take on. So for our perspective, the first test we do is jurisdiction, if it falls within our jurisdiction, public officer or public body within Victoria. And the next question we'll ask ourselves is it serious or systemic corrupt conduct? And that has to meet that test for us then to engage our investigative response. Likewise, it may well hit that threshold, but we simply don't have the resources to do it. Noting that Operation Sandon has been running for nearly 2 years. It's a really detailed and complex investigation, and we have quite a number of resources working on that, which makes it challenging to take on other roles in the local government sector. So my answer would be that we apply a risk lens across all the material that comes across our desk. If we don't have the resourcing to do it, then we have a number of options in terms of how to treat it. And one of those options is to refer it to the agency best placed to deal with it. Sometimes it's the Victorian Ombudsman's office, sometimes it's a local government inspectorate, but ultimately it is referred to an agency to deal with it, and the behaviours don't go unchecked. And it was interesting that the question didn't come from within the local government sector, Michael, it came from an external entity. So again, I think Adam's overview of the integrity system was really important to give a broad understanding of how it works in Victoria. And hopefully that little snapshot answer then gives you a guide as to how we deal with it internally when they come in across our desks. All right, so that draws us towards the end of our forum today. I'd like to thank you all for joining us, and a big thank you to our presenters and panellists and participants who've helped generate this forum and made it as informative as it has. I particularly want to thank our IBAC staff here who have worked tirelessly to put this together. It is quite an exercise to produce such a forum, and I really want to thank them and appreciate what they do for us. Before I wrap it up, I'd just like to mention that we have a number of reports available on the IBAC website to assist when dealing with conflicts of interest, including a research report on managing corruption risks associated with conflicts of interest in the Victorian public sector, and key findings from IBAC's Operation Becca and Maru. These can be found by going to IBAC's publications page. And to keep up to date with the latest publications and information from IBAC, you can subscribe to our e-newsletter or visit our website. Finally, as this webinar comes to an end, you'll be asked to complete a short feedback survey to help us plan the future engagement activities. Be much appreciated if you could contribute to that and help us shape how we deliver our communications for future forums and events. We look forward to seeing you at the next event we put on. Thank you again very much for joining us. Hopefully you found it informative, and we'll see you again next time. Bye for now.